Hello everyone, and welcome to this latest webinar from IHS Markit. My name is Alan Tatara, Event Manager for the IHS Markit Technology Group webinar team, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. Today's webinar is Managing Surveillance Data. Caught on tape, now keep it secure. Our panel will address key considerations for achieving a successful video surveillance strategy, touching on both current solutions and viable alternatives, and also highlight use cases for linear tape open technology for storing video data in a multi-tiered environment. Our webinar is co-presented by IHS Markit and our partner, the LTO Program. So before we get started, I want to highlight a few features available for you on our webinar and how you can make the most of your experience with us today. So the console that you're looking at is completely customizable. So you can open, close, move, or resize any of the windows that you have open on your screen and arrange the console to suit your preference. Now at the bottom of your console are a number of application widgets. These contain additional features available for you. A couple of buttons I want to mention. One is the resource list widget, and this is where you're going to find additional material about today's topic, including the downloadable slide deck from today's session, as well as other valuable resources, including a special white paper authored by our own analyst, Josh Woodhouse. And all these materials can be accessed and downloaded right from your console. And we do want to make this an interactive session, so we've included a Twitter widget at the bottom of your screen. So this means you'll be able to tweet directly from the console. And today we are using the hashtag video surveillance. We will also have a live Q&A session directly after the presentation, so please submit your questions or comments at any time by using the Q&A box that's on the left side of your screen. And if you do encounter any technical issues during the webinar, just click on that question mark widget and you will get the answers that you need. So now let me introduce our panel. First, leading our discussion is Josh Woodhouse. Josh is a senior analyst in the video surveillance segment at IHS Markit. And a special welcome to our panel members, all from the LTO program. We have Laura Loredo. Laura is Worldwide Product Manager at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. Also joining us is Carlos Sandoval. Carlos is Worldwide Offering Manager of Data Retention Infrastructures at IBM. And rounding our panel, we have Terry Cochran. Terry is Segment Marketing Manager at Quantum Corporation. So let's get started with our presentation. So Josh, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Alan. The voice you're now hearing is Josh Woodhouse. Thanks for that introduction. I would like to just quickly run through the agenda, what we're going to cover on today's webinar. So first you'll hear from me and I'll talk about some of the drivers for why we're seeing increased storage requirements from video surveillance equipment. We'll then look a little bit more specifically about maybe what some of those requirements are and what it takes to successfully store video surveillance equipment. I'll then hand you over to Laura, who will talk a little bit more about the specifics of LTO technology and give you a bit of an introduction to that. We'll then talk about logistically how you can utilize some of those technologies when you're storing video surveillance, what the systems are starting to look like. We'll then hear again from Laura and a bit more from the LTO program. We'll then sum up, and there will be some time for Q&A. So if you, as Alan's already said, if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A box at any point during the webinar. So we've grouped the drivers for this increase that we're seeing in video surveillance data and the storage requirements behind that into three main areas. So I'm going to run through those over the preceding slides. The first in the video surveillance industry at the moment is we've seen a huge increase in the number of video surveillance cameras that are entering the market, but also those that are being installed as well. And this is from IHS Markit. A big part of what we do is we track the industry very closely. And we're seeing that by the end of this year, we're going to see over 130 or nearly 130 million new cameras entering the video surveillance industry. And that's spread across network surveillance cameras, the newer HD analog or HD CCTV cameras, and also body-worn cameras for law enforcement as well. And these are what we're terming, I guess, professional grade or professionally sold cameras. So this is excluding the consumer and DIY type products you may purchase through a retail channel. What I would say about these numbers is that the Chinese market domestically is an important part of the industry, both from a production side, but also the domestic market as well. And they were accounting for around half of these shipments now in this year. But one of the key things to understand here is what's actually driving this demand. What's driving the increase in the number of cameras that enter the industry? There's a lot of different factors there, and we've actually sort of loosely ranked some of them in terms of their overall market influence, and I wanted to take you through two of the most influential. So the first of which is, I guess, an increase in the multiple uses of video surveillance equipment. If we think about in the past, traditionally, you would have video surveillance cameras and systems being installed almost entirely for safety and security point of views, but also maybe in something specific like retail, you had a big element of loss prevention where there was maybe a different set of professionals using the equipment. And if we look where we are in the present, the range of uses has evolved way beyond just safety and security and loss prevention. You now have a huge increase in the number of stakeholders that are sitting around the table who are involved in the purchasing decisions and the use of video surveillance equipment. So some of these other uses include the supply chain and logistics professionals and risk management, maybe using business operational data. A great example of that might be in monitoring factories and production lines, a bit of a convergence between video surveillance and machine vision. Quality control can be involved in that. You have health and safety professionals who are looking out for the safety of employees. We also have an economic side of things where you're seeing false alarm rates. People are aiming to cut them. So there's that video validation of safety, but also from a security point of view from alarms being raised from business premises. A great example that's sort of cited very regularly is the use of marketing data, particularly in some retail businesses or hospitality, that sort of thing. But it's not just customer marketing information that's now being collected from video surveillance systems. We've got this business operations side of that as well. So potentially in a shopping mall, you might have differential pricing for different units based upon data that you've collected through your video surveillance system. We also have the huge growing area of safe cities and smarter cities that are tapping into video as a key sensor in those environments, whether that be the general public buying into the use of video surveillance for gaining information about traffic, live updates as to what's going on with the city, maybe using information collected through video to pair with intelligent signage. There's a huge range of different uses here. The final one I wanted to talk on is also the police massively increasing their use of video surveillance from a fixed camera point of view, in vehicular, or also body worn as well, and a huge amount of digital evidence being collected through this technology. So that is the first, well, one of the most influential factors there that is driving the increased demand for cameras. The second one that's been, the IHS market has been tracking over, the last decade or so is price. Now, we've seen a lot more cameras purchased simply because the average selling price has decreased dramatically. If you look at this graphic showing the average price of a network camera before it enters the channel, you can see that from 2012 through to 2015, that the average price there more than halved. So what you're seeing is people essentially are being able to get a lot more cameras for their money. At some of the lower end of the market, that has really removed some of the cost barriers towards entry. And at the higher end, and then maybe into the sort of medium size installations, you're able to network more cameras together. You can buy a lot more cameras for your money. Maybe you can put up additional cameras where in the past, cost may have prevented you from considering that as an option. Now, obviously, the demand in unit shipments increasing and the falling in price is starting to have effect from the market point of view in terms of revenue growth rates. Another area that is very, very important here is the Chinese vendors. I'll briefly touch on the competitive environment here. I mentioned in one of the first slides about the influence of China on this market from a sort of global perspective as well. Now we've got Chinese vendors, have increased their market share and increased price competition in many of the markets globally. And what has that led to is sort of a concentration in terms of the competitive environment for the video surveillance equipment. The second group of key drivers as to what has increased the demand for storage requirements is these the cameras that you buy today typically are of a higher specification than those you may have purchased a number of years ago. And one of the most important things for a video surveillance camera is obviously the video quality. Now that has many different factors involved in it. It's a complex matrix in terms of what actually makes up quality video. But one of the things that we can measure quite easily from a marketing point of view, or from a market point of view, I should say, is the resolution of cameras. Now, the typical camera today is a 1080p full HD capable network camera. And if we look at the next step up, we've seen huge growth in the 4 and 5 megapixel camera range, and then from a 4K perspective, it's becoming very prevalent with consumer awareness and in mobile phones, TVs, that sort of consumer. It's going to be the next resolution that consumers are demanding. And that's sort of trickling down into the video surveillance industry as well. For a long time, you've been able to get higher resolution megapixel cameras. And even this year, only about 3% of total network cameras are going to be of that sort of equivalent 4K resolution. But what we're going to see is we're going to see a huge jump over the next few years. And we saw that again with non-HD cameras jump into first 720p, then 1080p, and we've already started to see that from a 4 and 5 megapixel camera range. So we're expecting this huge uplift in the market average, if you will, resolution. And so what that means is each camera is going to generally generate more data. Now, those of you listening who are familiar with the video surveillance industry are going to say, well, what about compression? That's been a huge factor in the sort of data that's going to be generated by an individual camera or a collection of cameras in the system. And there has been a lot of innovation in the side of compression technologies in the video surveillance market. We've seen the mass adoption of H.264 now, and that's moved on to some proprietary variations of that with a lot of innovation there, based on that standard. And we're not quite at the level yet of H.265, but the key point here is that despite these advances, because of the sheer number of new cameras entering the market and that jump in resolution that we've already seen and we're expecting to continue in the future, these advances in compression technology are not going to negate that overall increase in data and that requirement for storage. I should really talk about video analytics at this stage as well. They are a really key element to the latest generation of video surveillance cameras, and they're enabling a lot of those multiple uses that we talked about a few slides back. We're at this sort of the start of a real disruptive technology in that side of things, deep learning compared to traditional rule-based analytics, which is really enabling us to move from this traditional live alert type of approach to really the characterization of a whole environment through video surveillance equipment. And what that's going to do is this multiple use is going to bring efficiencies, and you're going to be able to gain these efficiencies if you have that capability within your system and you have the underlying infrastructure, the network, but also the storage system set up to correctly store the data and make sure that it's accessible for all those different uses that I outlined in a few slides back. So the third and final sort of group of these drivers that it's increasing the storage demand is really the increased value of data and also the longer retention time. So the amount of time that this video surveillance data and the footage is being stored. These have both increased. And I just mentioned analytics there, and that's one of the things that's helped to highlight the sort of perceived value of the data, that people are seeing all these different uses and seeing what is capable from the latest generation cameras, and that's we're seeing a lot of convergence in the industry and this evolution from beyond just security. Now, in terms of the amount of time that data is then stored, this extended retention, that's really this force multiplier, and there's a few different factors behind that. So legislation generally has a limited effect on the overall industry, but in specific end user industries or specific geographic markets, it can actually be pretty influential. So there's a few examples of that. For example, Qatar in the Middle East is often cited as one of the most heavily regulated surveillance markets in the world. And by law there, if you have a hotel or a shopping center, you have to have an IP surveillance camera system and you have to store all footage for 120 days. Similarly, in closer to home to many of you in North America, if you're involved in the medical marijuana dispensary, there's a lot of legislation coming in state by state stating that you have to have a certain type of video surveillance system and footage has to be stored for a particular length of time as well. So it's important that people comply with that legislation where it applies, but that is also, we've seen a big driver there of people requiring generally a greater retention time and larger surveillance system for storage. In terms of anti-litigation, it's similar, that we've seen something called the tort laws in the US, where you maybe have 2 years to bring a civil case. So a great example would be in retail and in other end user industries. People are finding that they can store their video surveillance data for longer to help defend against any slip and fall claims, for example. The cost of extending your retention may be tens of thousands of dollars, but if you're able to successfully defend a lawsuit against your organization, then the return on investment is, just from one case, is immediately clear. Similarly to that, insurance is another big driver of this extended retention. Some insurers, from a public liability point of view, are requesting it. You can often receive cheaper premiums if you're storing your data for longer as well. So there's those elements adding the value there as well. Those of you listening from maybe a law enforcement or a digital evidence management point of view, we'll touch upon the video evidence side of things later on as well, but that is also a big driver in terms of the length of time that you need to store video evidence for. If video data could be used in a criminal case, then you can have a retention that is increased by decades. So just to sum up in this section, if we put those three groups of drivers together, what we've actually found is that the typical data generated by a new camera that's entering the surveillance market, if you look at the whole market perspective, there's been a huge increase each year in terms of that data, and From 2015 to 2016, it was around 336 petabytes per day. Additionally, was being generated by all the new cameras entering the market. So that's a collection of more cameras, those cameras being higher specification, and that increased value of that data as well. So there's a huge increase in the storage requirements from this industry. So I wanted to talk a little bit more now about specifically what it takes to store this footage. Now, you'll see on the screen, hopefully, there's a poll question here. So I would like everyone to vote. This can be end users and integrators. At the moment, when you're configuring a video surveillance system or using it, are you finding you're having to compromise? And if so, what are you having to compromise on when you're storing video surveillance footage? Is it the length of time that you are storing it for, the retention time? Is it maybe the quality that you're storing at? Are you finding you're having to reduce that quality? Or is it maybe the number of camera streams you're stored? Are you storing less than you maybe would like to? Or do you think that actually you're not actually having to compromise on anything? So I'll give you a few minutes to vote on the console there. We just want to get some results from those of you who are on the webinar today. So again, if you are involved in the industry, if you have a video surveillance system that you're using, or you are involved in installing or integrating those, are you finding you're having to compromise? And if so, what are you compromising on? Is it the length of time you store footage for? Is it the quality that you're storing it at? Maybe that be resolution or frame rate, or is it the number of cameras that you are storing? So we'll just hopefully, I think, give everyone another 10 seconds, and then we can move to the results of this question. Okay, we'll move ahead now. So we can see in the results there that the most popular answers that people are having to compromise on is the retention time and the video quality are both equally compromised on. There's it's clear that only 5.7% of you are compromising on nothing. So there's clearly a need to address this when we look at video surveillance storage design. Got one more question for you, just while everyone is on here. If you're looking at storing your video for a long term, if you're keeping that video surveillance footage for a long time, typically what storage media do you store that on? Are you storing it on tape? Are you storing it on disk? Are you putting it in the cloud? Or are you using something else? Or do you not know? So again, if everyone could just vote on that this poll question, and then we can see the results. So again, I'll read the question out one more time. When you're storing video surveillance footage and you're keeping it for a long time, and what are you storing that on? Is it tape? Are you using disk? Are you putting it in the cloud? Using something else, or do you not know? Okay, so the majority of you are using disk. That's to be expected. We see that in the industry as well. The majority of video surveillance end users have this sort of traditional approach for the long-term retention of video surveillance data, where there's the video management server, whether that layer, whether that's lots of MVRs, whether you've got a server running a VMS application, and maybe some internal storage there. And then when people are looking to store their footage for longer, the footage is kept on primarily disk for that long-term retention. And sometimes, we see this fairly rarely, but sometimes there might be an additional tier that's perhaps on tape or in the cloud, as we saw from those previous results. And what we see with that is that layer is often disconnected. So what we mean by that is it's often not actually connected to the video management server layer. There might be some manual intervention in terms to access that data once it reaches that additional archive tier. And as we can see, that approach from the first poll question we had, it's maybe not best suited in all applications. We've seen that the majority of you here on the webinar are finding you'll have to compromise on something, and that doesn't have to be the case, as we'll talk about later on. So just briefly, when people are storing their video surveillance footage, the workloads and the requirements can be very different to a traditional IT, an IT environment. For video surveillance footage, your system needs to be configured to be very write intensive. The majority of footage that is kept is never reviewed, so the system needs to be able to be writing, all the time, and be very configured towards the write side of things rather than the reads. Often, as we've seen again at the start of this webinar, there's huge increase in the specification and the resolution of cameras and the number of cameras, so it's often a high bandwidth requirement. This can change in some unexpected ways as well. If there is an event, your bitrate can jump. You can have a huge spike in bandwidth, which is sometimes you're not able to predict that. Similarly, maybe if you had a body-worn application, where you have a lot of police officers that are coming off shift, you might have no activity, and then all of a sudden you might have a lot of input into your system as well with people using the storage system. We also need to have a flexible system for future-proofing. So you don't necessarily want to be tied into one type of architecture. You may have cameras which go down and you may need to replace them or expand your system. And as we've seen, there's a huge increase and quite a rapid increase in the typical spec of a camera. So you need to be able to cope with those sort of changes as well. And lastly, if the worst does occur and you maybe have failure, there are a lot of systems will have redundancy built in, but in some mission critical scenarios, you maybe need complete redundancy, whereby you can still record even with a failure of some sort, because certain scenarios cannot allow for the video surveillance system to go down. One other big area that's very specific in this industry and what you need to think about in terms of storing video surveillance data is, can it be used for video evidence? So have you captured it, and have you compromised? We've seen there that people have maybe compromised on the length of time or the quality that they are storing this footage, and that can potentially could affect the use of it in video evidence. Another big consideration here is the chain of custody. If this, again, any police end users or city surveillance end users listening, understanding how to maintain this chain of custody and essentially demonstrating that this evidence is tamper-free, is very critical, and a lot of that rests with the sort of underlying infrastructure and the storage here. Bit of a misconception I'd like to address. I think this can be maintained with the cloud, so you can maintain a chain of custody with a cloud system, but often there's potential costs to be aware of there. So in North America, you might have to use a special compliant data center, which may charge a premium compared to other non-compliant data centers for other different sort of data uses. So the key thing to understand is here, when you're looking at this long-term video retention, is it going to be of an evidential quality, and is the system configured to capture that video evidence? Because if it's used in a criminal case, or if it's used in a civil case, potentially the retention can increase to decades. So police and city end users really need to be aware of that, make sure their system is sufficient to cope with that. So that's the first two sections of the webinar. I would like to remind everyone at this stage, if you do have any questions about anything I've just raised there, please use the Q&A function. And I'll now hand you over to Laura, who's going to talk a little bit more about LTO technology. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Josh. Well, let me start by asking the audience another good question. So are you familiar with LTO technology and LTFS, the linear tape file system? The possible answers are yes, we are users, or we know the technology well. Yes, but don't know much about it, and no, this is my introduction to the technology. So I'll give you a few seconds to answer before we show the results. So quickly, how familiar are you with the LTO technology and LTFS? We are users, so we know the technology well. We know it, but we don't know much about it. And no, this is really my introduction to the technology. So let's take a look. Well, quite interesting. We have a handful of experts on the line, right? And we also have people not so familiar with the technology. So hopefully you are in the right webinar to learn about the LTO technology and how it's used in video surveillance. And let me start introducing the LTO program. So the LTO program consists of 3 technology provider companies. We also call them the TPCs, and these are HPE, IBM, and Quantum. The 3 companies get together to write the specifications of the LTO technology. And these specifications are an open standard, and they are licensed to any organization that want to make LTO products. These products then are verified and make sure that they comply with the specifications and the format of the technology. And if so, they are granted the use of the LTO logo. We have a number, over 30 licenses and multiple media manufacturers. Now, the LTO program is also responsible for publishing the LTO Roadmap. And currently, our roadmap has 10 generations with capacities going up to 100 terabytes per cartridge. And we are going to have a look in more detail at this roadmap. So the latest generation of the technology is generation 7, with previous generations still available in the market. Generation 7 provides 15 terabytes capacity per cartridge that is compressed, 6 terabytes native capacity per cartridge, and transfer rates of up to 300 megabytes per second native. As with previous generations, Generation 7 is backwards compatible, read with Generation 5 and Generation 6, and write back compatible with Generation 6. So basically, a Generation 7 drive will read Generation 5 and 6 cartridges and will write Generation 6 cartridges. From Generation 3 of the technology, we introduced WORM, write once, read many, for regulatory purposes. Since Generation 4, we have encryption in the format. This is hardware encryption that doesn't impact neither capacity or transfer rate. And since Generation 5 of the technology, we introduce partitioning, which enables for the linear tape file system, LTFS, which allows an LTO to appear as a mount point in your system, making the use of tape much easier than we had before. Now, looking out in the future, the TPCs are already working on the specifications for the LTO-8 format, and according to the roadmap, will be up to 32 terabytes compressed capacity, or around an impressive 12 terabytes native. And we will carry on with WORM, encryption, and partitioning in the format. And then looking out further out in the future, Generation 10, up to 120 terabytes compressed, and that is 48 terabytes capacity per cartridge. Now, really, what all this means in terms of video surveillance storage? Well, a single LTO 7 cartridge, and I'll emphasize this, one single LTO 7 cartridge can hold up to 13 days of footage coming from 10 full high-definition cameras, streaming 24 hours per day at 15 frames per second. Or a single LTO 7 cartridge can hold up to 7 days of footage coming from 5 4K cameras, streaming 24 hours a day at 15 frames per second. And as more storage is required, we just only need to add more cartridges to our solution to be able to scale out the storage capacities. Now, for future generation of the technology, we see how this amount of data that can be stored per cartridge increases to the point that if we look at generation 10, we will be able to store an undeliverable 107 days of footage coming from 10 full high-definition cameras streaming at 24 hours per day. And with that, I will pass it back to Josh, who is going to talk about using tape storage for video surveillance.
Thanks, Laura. So hopefully that's given you a bit more of a background to the format here. But now we want to just cover specifically how you might actually use that when you're looking at storing video surveillance. And the way that we see this being used is in a multi-tiered storage environment. So what that means is you are utilizing different types of storage, but everything is connected through a single file system. So essentially it appears as one drive. But that also means that to the user, it's agnostic. They're probably not going to realize which particular tier of storage the data they're working with is coming from. Now, the other thing to understand here is that the cloud side of things, again, it can fit in here where appropriate. Cloud can be storage media agnostic. You may store data in the cloud and not necessarily realize exactly what it's being stored on. And we see the use of cloud for video surveillance also fitting into that sort of single file system, and it can be used where appropriate. So some examples might be tying together multi-site operations where there's lots of different inputs from different areas being stored together in one private or public cloud, and also maybe in the example of mission critical, really high security camera feeds being duplicated or backed up in the cloud as well. That's another great example of where we see this being used. Another really important thing to understand is it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and that traditional architecture we talked about already, no matter how long, once video data is moved to this longer-term retention, most people were using disk on the webinar, it's just treated the same throughout its lifetime, and that doesn't really make sense. And we'll talk about some specifics in the next slide, but chances are once an initial period is over, they're very unlikely to review this data. So keeping it on a high performance disk for the entirety of its lifetime, which as we've seen could be years, makes very little sense, maybe from an economic point of view, but also maybe from an efficiency point of view as well. So what we're saying is you can actually size your system. So once you get into that longer term retention, you can build out your capacity using this, this tape. The LTO, being a great example of that. So this slide shows a specific example. It's quite a simplistic one as what this system might look like. So you've got quite a large system, 450 1080p cameras. And we have a petabyte of storage across the system, 28% of which is on the primary disk tier. This gives you the highest performance surveillance grade hard disk drives, and the capacity there is about 14 days worth of footage. And once that is filled up, once the footage is older than 14 days, automatically you can move that through the single file system onto the second tier of storage. In this case, this is 120 LTO Generation 7 cartridges. And you get an additional 36 days of storage there. So in total, you're storing this 450 1080p cameras for 50 days. This ratio is typical of what we've started to see, maybe the primary tier being 25 to 30% of the total capacity, and then the remainder being built out on tape, or maybe even using other storage medias. This is a simplistic example with 2 tiers of storage, but you can be more. We talked about some of the other things. You could bring in cloud, you could bring in all sorts of things into this this type of architecture. Now, the great thing about this is once you've decided on your first tier, your primary tier, you maybe think the highest performance tier, you don't have to add any more disks. So once unless you want to add more cameras and more bandwidth, you can keep that first tier the same size. And the chances of you reviewing this footage are highest in the first 14 days in this example, but after that, the chances of it being reviewed could drop off significantly, and therefore you can use this tape to build out that capacity. And if you want to increase that, if there's an unforeseen set of circumstances, you maybe want to store this or store particular bits of data for longer, you can use tape to build that out. So it's all about moving around the data in this sort of flexible multi-tiered environment. Now, in the past, many of you who have used tape, or if this is not your first introduction to using tape in a video surveillance sort of environment, potentially there could have been gripes or difficulty with using tape. From a logistical point of view. But in some of the latest generation technologies, we have this thing available called a batch prefetch plugin, and this is a plugin for many of the leading VMS, the video management software applications available on the market. And what it actually does is when the data is moved from that primary tier of disk recording through to the tape tier, it retains small stub-start files on that primary tier, and what that means is it sort of acts like an index. So if there is an example where you then have to recall some of the older data back to the disk to work with it, it speeds the whole process up and it's much quicker. The other thing that it does is it enables all of the footage you have saved to be available to the VMS end user. So the sort of workflow here is that you can do everything from within the VMS. You don't have to get anyone else involved. You don't have to get IT involved to manually go and reload some of the older footage. You can use VMS searches. Those searches aren't necessarily going to time out, which was a problem in the past of some of these multi-tiered environments. Now with this plugin, you're able to work entirely in your VMS timeline, and the end user is going to notice a little limited difference between a recall from tape and disk. So it really gives a lot more power to the surveillance user, particularly for investigations. They can go back as long as they possibly can, and there's no need to get anyone else involved. So one of the key reasons you might consider using tape in this way is generally you can for that longer term retention, once you've moved things off your initial retention period into those longer time frames, you can achieve a higher capacity for a lower cost. It means you can balance your budget a little bit more efficiently with the mission, so you're not having to compromise. We would say that when you're working with your chosen provider, a total cost of ownership analysis is incredibly important, and it's essential that you try and include and try and make that as realistic as possible. And obviously, each scenario is different, and it may not make sense, in every scenario. But you can use a framework available from your chosen provider to do that analysis. But generally speaking, when this has been looked into, you're seeing for this sort of longer term retention, you can achieve a lower cost for capacity with tape. From a media point of view as well, you can receive a lower price. And all of this is really about thinking differently in terms of the not treating data the same over its life cycle, because it doesn't really make sense to have this one-size-all approach that's traditionally been the case when you've needed long-term video surveillance retention. So I just want to pass you back over to Lara, who's going to talk in a little bit more detail about LTO again. So over to you, Lara.
Thank you, Josh. Well, let's take a look at the top 10 reasons as to why tape is in the hot list for best practices in data storage. So the first one is cost. Tape costs less than any other digital storage. And with LTO 7, tape is less than a cent per gigabyte per cartridge compressed, exactly 0.7 cents per cartridge per gigabyte compressed, and that is a very attractive cost. If you go to the LTO website at lto.org, we have a few white papers, and we have in particular TCO study made by ESD Group, where it shows for long-term data retention how LTO technology has a 577% return on investment over disk, with an average TCO of 85% savings when we compare LTO with disk system only. Number two is tape is easy to manage. An administrator can manage petabytes of data stored on tape, whereas typically can only manage 100 terabytes of data on disk. Reliable. Tape is highly reliable for a number of technical reasons. For example, read after write verification. So every time we write data on tape, we read it back. And we make sure that what we are reading back is exactly what we have in the cache of the drive. And we will not move on until we verify that that data that's been written on tape is exactly what we were supposed to be writing. There are other mechanisms like server tracking for precise positioning, and we have very powerful error detection, error recovery, and error correction algorithms. All of that give us 2 orders of magnitude better bit error rate than enterprise SATA disks. A key best practice is always to have system isolation data storage, so offline storage to protect data from threats that can corrupt online data. For example, viruses, human errors, system errors, and of course these days very popular ransomware. Number 5 is tape is easy to use, and we have automated tape libraries that make the handling of tape simple and requires no people to be moving tapes in and out of drives. And of course with LTFS, with the linear tape file system, files are very easy to view and very easy to access. Number 6, To increase tape storage is very easy. You don't have to add any more hardware, or you don't have to add any more controllers like you will do with disk. You simply add more cartridges, and basically you have infinite capacity on demand. Number 7 is long shelf life. So manufacturers quote up to 30 years shelf life at normal room conditions for cartridges. Number 8, tape storage has a very small carbon footprint. Now, a tape drive has very low energy consumption when it's reading or when it's writing, and even lower when it's idle. And a tape cartridge in a library slot or a tape cartridge in a shelf really doesn't consume any power. And these days, moving big amounts of data it's quite costly because of the high speed lines, and it's time consuming. Whereas, for example, imagine taking 30 LTO7 cartridges, put them in a box that is 180 terabytes of capacity of data uncompressed. You can ship that from one end of the States to the other in about 15 hours overnight, and will probably cost you less than $200. Now, that makes a very effective transfer rate of over 12 terabytes per hour. Now, transporting tapes and transporting data in this way is very easy and very cost effective. And we call this low cost, high bandwidth in a box. And lastly, tape is fast. LTO7 data transfer rates uncompressed are 300 megabytes per second. That is faster than most disk drives can transfer data at. And so with this, we now understand why tape is so important in the storage spectrum. And I will pass it back to Josh, who is going to wrap up the webinar with some conclusions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So we'll briefly sum up. And again, if you do have a question, we'll try and get through them in a moment. So please do use the function to ask that. So we've seen from the start from me why the storage requirements from video surveillance systems are increasing. You've got to ask yourself, is your current approach, is that capable to cope with these increases? Is it also affordable? And are you going to be able to store and retain evidential quality video from the latest cameras that you maybe have invested in? You've hopefully got a better understanding now of how tape can sort of fit into this whole storage system. You can use it as a low cost, a high capacity, active tier in a multi-tiered environment alongside your traditional disk storage. When you do that, it fits in nicely with the VMS architecture. So you can, from an operational point of view, you will, the end user will not be aware necessarily where the data is stored, and you can easily, without anyone else being involved, move data around. So that being said, this will all enable you, if you take up this sort of approach, to build out your capacity with tape and have a much more efficient use of budget versus your mission, and actually find that you compromise less, so you can gain very valuable details and insight which you otherwise may have lost due to compromises on the video quality or the length of time which you've been storing this data. So please do think regarding this topic, and please download our white paper, which is accompanying this webinar, which is titled "Caught on Tape, Now Keep It Secure." So now I'm just going to read through some of the questions which we've been getting through. So the first one actually that's popped up here is we've got a question. Someone says, what type of surveillance projects are ideal for this tiered tape-based solution? So anyone from the team want to take that?
I'll take that, Josh. Well, tier solutions are very flexible architectures and allows you to move less frequently used data to a more cost-effective storage media. When we're talking about tape-based tier, really allows you to get a secondary storage tier designed for high capacity, lower cost, and higher reliability with LTO technology and LTFS. And so you can retain data for longer periods of time and making sure that the data is maintained safe and secure. And as we saw throughout the presentation, you can scale out in that capacity as you require. So really for those projects where data might be required in the future for reasons of legal reasons or regulatory reasons, or you mentioned analytics to extract extra information in the future, this tier-based solution is really a very good approach which provides more effective use of your budget and greater retention times.
Thank you. Next question. How do you differentiate LTO from other storage technologies? Anyone want to take that from the team?
Yeah, this is Terry. I'm happy to take that. So with LTO technology, especially when using LTFS, it really provides a much more versatile solution than 100% disk-based solutions. If you think about it, it has a cost factor of less than 10 cents on the dollar versus disk, even less if you're looking at just immediate costs as you expand capacity. So when thinking of, for example, for surveillance data, it provides the appropriate level of access and streaming performance needed. And in some results from a recent proof of concept we did for a large government opportunity, they found that they were able to access 24 hours of data each for 4 different cameras in just 18 minutes. If you think about it, that's 96 hours of video. The customer actually thought that the data was coming off of disk. So LTO is a much more cost-effective solution for retaining video data.
Okay, thanks, Terry. Next question. In a tiered storage system, how do you manage and configure which tier the data is stored on and moved to? And this can be, I guess, the question goes on. This could be especially prevalent if there might be differences there in the performance. Anyone want to try and address that question?
Sure, I can take that. This is Carlos Sandoval. I'm with the offering management team at IBM. In order to be successful, the surveillance application needs to be basically latency aware. And as you have well described, Josh, this is part of the multi-tier infrastructure. So once the application understands the latency of the different tiers, the user experience can be well understood, and any user experience issues can be properly managed. Also on the workflow chart on slide 24, you went through. There are often some technologies like batch data recall that can make the recalls for the data being used for forensic viewing, mostly.
Okay, thanks, Carlos. One more question. We have so what is the sort of recommended storage footprint to start with tape? So when does it become cost-effective versus disk? We talked earlier about that sort of long-term retention, but can anyone offer any more specifics on that?
I can take that. So really, tape scales down as low as a single standalone tape drive with a single cartridge, so you can just manually load and unload, to a huge, massive library with thousands of slots and hundreds of tape drives inside, all automated. So what I want to say with this is that as long as you have data that doesn't need to be frequently accessed, you can start moving that data to your second tier, to tape, because that data is taking a space in your primary storage, in a storage that is more expensive than your secondary tier. So any data that doesn't need to be accessed very frequently, any data that needs to be stored for long-term retention, archiving, is already taking too much space in your primary storage. So from your first terabyte, you can start moving data out to tape and free up that costly tier 1 storage media.
Great. Thank you. So I think we've got time for one more quick question. Just someone has asked, what exactly is WORM? What is that acronym? Can we expand on what that actually means and provides? Someone take that.
I'm fine to address that if nobody else wants.
Yeah, I think if you've got a quick answer.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. WORM means write once, read many. So basically, what it makes you is a special type of cartridge that makes sure that once you write data on it, you cannot change it, you cannot rewrite it, you cannot alter that data. You can read it, but it's unalterable, basically. So this is used for regulatory compliance for many standards that need proof that the data hasn't been tampered with, that hasn't been rewritten, hasn't been erased, and hasn't been modified since has gone to tape. And so the LTO program provides WORM cartridges since generation 3 of the technology.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Right, we are back. We are out of time. I'll pass back to Alan for the final wrap-up.
Thanks, Josh. I want to thank everyone for participating on our webinar today, for submitting all of your questions. We did receive a large number, and our panel will follow up with you via email after the webinar. Special thanks for Josh for leading our discussion, as well as all of our presenters for this very informative discussion. So an archived version of this webinar will be made available shortly, so feel free to come back and view it again or even share it with your colleagues. Just a note, you're going to see a short survey pop up at the conclusion of this webinar, so please take a few moments to fill that out. And lastly, make sure you follow us on Twitter for information on future IHS Markit Technology Group webinars. So again, thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.